and the physicist, and I am now starting the recording. I should have done that earlier. But this is the bonus content. You guys who actually showed up synchronously get the bonus content of the joke. All right, so we've got a lot of stuff to do today. I do want to quickly touch on a few things just to keep things going. I'm going to throw the peer review link, the rubric that you're supposed to be using to evaluate. Hopefully you guys have all been using this to develop your projects. But the peer review link, the presentation rubric, and the final report, final list of contributions report are all pasted into the chat right now. If you look at the presentation, that's not what I wanted. If you look at the presentation form, right? That's the peer review link. That's the very first link. If you look at that, just hopefully you guys are all doing this. Just go through and give us some help in making sure that we don't miss anything in your peers' presentations. You'll need 6 of these today, or 5 of these if you're presenting, 6 of these if you're not. And then finally, we do have this final list of contributions form. You know what? Let me transition over here. This is what the peer review form looks like, right? Your name, the project name, the identifier, so I can get to it fast. Your role, I'll be an instructor today. And then 1 to 5 on what everybody goes. You can think of the 1 as about an F, and the 5 as about an A. So that's kind of the relative scale. Just give us some feedback as to what you thought they did. And I am actually expecting these to be, I'm expecting that most everybody's going to do a good job. If not a stellar job, but at least good. And finally, here's the final contributions report. I went over this, I think, in exhaustive and far too much detail last class, but I did want to mention that on May 3rd, we're going to go through and start giving you your final grades, and that means we have to give you a grade for your contributions. These have to be put out into the wilds of open source, and they have to be licensed correctly, which means that you probably want them in a repository or on a wiki site. Or on the blog site. I think one of the things I ask you for is your blog site, assuming you just in case you didn't use the one out of Observatory Arcos.io. Give me your blog site so we can click on there and go and look at your blogs, and then give us a list of all the contributions you want us to take care of, including issues, issues you submitted to an open source repository, including commits you submitted to an open source repository, including documentation you pasted to a wiki site, all of that types of stuff. Google documents are a little bit problematic in that there's really very little way to properly attribute them in your, if you've ever searched for Google documents, you know how hard it is to get something as a combined whole. So please, if you're using a Google document, download it, throw it into your repository somehow, or put it in a private repository. Make sure you have it licensed correctly, so we can actually give you the credit that you deserve. I know Google Documents are a wonderful way to, and if you can, I don't know if you can export the history or something like that. That would be useful as well. Google Documents are great ways to co-develop stuff, but they're not really good ways to put it away for posterity or to share it with a broad, it's nice to share narrowly, but it's not as good to share broadly. It's hard to find. There's not a good way to. Anyway, please kind of take that into consideration. And again, you can buy that by downloading it in an exportable format like PDF even, and try to put that into your repositories or into a separate documentation repository, properly licensed, etc. Okay. That was 90% of what I wanted to talk about today. But as with all things, stuff keeps happening to us. I don't know if you guys have looked at the off topic. I don't know how many of you actually read the off topic thread in our Discord, but here it is. And there's a bunch of postings. I think Prasant was the initiator of all this way back when. By the way, this is a very interesting post as well from Hunter about doesn't help you guys, but maybe next semester we won't have to muck around with the WSL quite so much. But Prasant posted some things on a study that came out of the University of Michigan, Minnesota. Dang it, Minnesota. Okay. And there's a bunch of posts on this, a bunch of different posts. I think my last post was the best analysis that I saw. So I've been kind of moderating this. So this is the last one. I think it's the best analysis of it. But reading back through a little bit of the history would be good. So let me just kind of set the stage for you guys on this one. University of Minnesota decides they're going to do research on how hard it is to get what they're calling hypocrite commits. So they take an open source project and they make commits that ostensibly fix an existing issue, but within that they embed malicious code that will allow them to backdoor later. Now, their claim is that none of this ever got into code because they stopped it during the review process, and their study was to examine supply chain issues with this. Okay, so there is, that's their disclaimer on this. But this is problematic from a number of standpoints. First off, we don't know that that's the truth, right? There were 198 or something, or 900. I don't know. There were a slew of commits from the University of Minnesota, and particularly from this work group that they don't know that the Linux Foundation now has to be skeptical as to whether they were correct or not. So this has raised some really big issues and some really big issues in ethical research as well. So since the 50s, there were some really unethical research studies that were done. The Tuskegee Airmen study being one example, where Black Americans were allowed to get, I believe it was syphilis, or with syphilis. Some were treated, some were not treated. This was before they knew. It started before they knew and before they had a cure for the disease. So they were examining the effects of different treatment. They didn't tell them they were in a study. And worse than that, when they actually had the solution, when they actually had a cure for it, they allowed the study to continue without actually giving the cure to the control group, essentially the untreated leg. So that was a horrible study, and it's horrible on multiple levels, but it's resulted in a number of things that have to occur in research in order for research on human studies to go forward. And this, I've received a certain level of training on this, and I know a good deal about it. But there are people who have studied this and can probably give you even additional details. But the idea is that, in general, any research you do on humans has to be it has to require informed consent. So if I'm going to do research on you guys, even to the extent of just giving you a survey, that there are certain surveys like your please rate our service at IHOP. That would probably sneak through underneath the guidelines. But if I'm going to research on you, right, not how are we doing? If I'm going to do research on you, then you have to have informed consent. So I have to tell you I'm doing research. I have to give you the opportunity to opt out, and I actually have to give you the opportunity to opt out at any point in the study. And I have to do things like, tell you how your data is going to be used, allow for anonymity, or not allow for anonymity, and at least inform you, tell you of the possible dangers of answering my survey. There's all sorts of things you have to go through, and that's all controlled by something called an institutional review board, IRB. So when you want to do studies, you have to present it to the IRB, and they tell you whether your study design is good or not, and whether there's any issues with your study. There are some few certain exceptions for this informed consent rule. If it's extremely important research, if you can't get the data any other way, and if you tell them afterward, you inform them afterward how they're about this, then in very rare circumstances, and this is pretty controversial when you try to do something like this, you can get by for limited studies. So these guys went in, they didn't apply for an IRB, they didn't get IRB approval prior to studying the research. There's some evidence that after the study was completed, when they realized they were maybe in a little bit of hot water, they went out and got, and that's my spin on it, but it does appear that they may have gone for IRB approval afterwards. So they didn't get it looks like they didn't have IRB approval before they started, which would have probably required them to do informed consent. They did get it afterward, which says that their IRB office essentially rubber stamped what is arguably a bad study. So anyway, let's just take a look at a couple of things. This one is probably the best article to actually talk about to talk about the dark reading one is probably the best one to actually talk about what went on. But why is this no longer going to the dark? Huh. Okay, so anyway, the study's now been suspended while they reinvestigate the IRB stuff. This talks about what they did. It also talks about the Linux. This was done to the Linux kernel, by the way. So if you think about the Linux kernel, that's used in all sorts of security applications. It's used by thousands of people. It's hard to argue that this isn't human research, because it's looking at how patches get into the Linux kernel, and what can be done about it. So this almost, under any definition that I've seen of human research, this would pretty much fall. And they didn't do informed consent, and they put in things that could, had they gotten into the code, had there been any issue, had somebody prematurely checked something in before they were able to withdraw the patch, had they not been convincing enough in their claims, this could have resulted in actual bad code being put in the kernel. Even if you accept all of their, even if you accept at face value everything the Minnesota researchers said. So this isn't arguing that this isn't important research. It is arguing, however, that they were attacking a known problem. This is not unique. They were trying to characterize it and make a name for themselves, but this wasn't an unknown problem. There are all sorts of retrospectives that have been looked at the supply chain, getting hypocrite commits into the dangers and the ability of getting hypocrite commits into the system. So this isn't unique. It doesn't appear that it was the only way to get the data. The data is available. Analytical data from actual events is available, and it's a known problem. So it's not like this is groundbreaking research that can only be gotten one specific way. Anyway, at the end, the Linux researchers, when they found out about this, when this was published back in February, the Linux researchers, and I guess I should be sitting there. The Linux researchers first pulled these commits, tried to have a conversation with the University of Minnesota researchers. The University of Minnesota researchers remained unrepentant, essentially. They did apologize for doing it, but they said it was necessary. And when the Linux people got fed up enough, they pulled all access from University of Minnesota to, all commits from the University of Minnesota were banned, all commits from these researchers were banned, and all commits from the University of Minnesota were over the past, there were however many of them there were actually reverted. Right, here's where they talk about the problematic issues with the study, along with the claims of the claims of the researchers. I'm looking for the Linux response. Yeah, so Greg Crow Hartman banned the University of Minnesota from contributing and pledged to reverse all previous patches submitted by the researchers pending review. And I think this was on the order of hundreds of patches. And the researchers are coming back and claiming that, they identified those patches that were problematic, and there was no reason to ban all the rest. But here's where now we're faced with, so all of that is going on in the background, and a lot of that is ethical versus unethical behavior. You can read up on that. You can make your own judgments. Was this good research? Was it necessary research? Did they behave ethically? That's all something that you should, if you're planning on continuing in computer science, if you're planning on doing any research, and you can do research even as somebody coming out with a bachelor's. I did research for a number of years with a bachelor's before I went back and upped my degree, mainly so I could get my name as lead author on papers. That's a little joke. But you should be aware of these ethical implications. The other thing you have to be aware of is this banning of Minnesota and banning of this and the reversion of this researchers' work. We're working in an open source environment. And this is kind of the narrative that I want to kind of get out here, the things I want you to think about. We're working in an open source environment. Open source environments are better in general, arguably better in general, at finding bugs once they've been introduced into the code. But if you've ever tried to read somebody else's patch and guarantee that there are no hidden bugs, on any sufficiently complicated patch, there are all sorts of opportunities to embed malicious code, right? I mean, some of these were simply reusing a null pointer, right? They had a pointer to something, they released the pointer, they accessed the pointer afterward. You'll catch that some of the times. If you have hundreds of these to review, you're probably going to miss a few, right? It's just how much on your game are you when you're reviewing these things, and do your existing test suite have the ability to detect them? And the answer isn't always yes, right? It is often yes, but it's not always yes. So a malicious participant in open source can introduce errors. And now we have to weigh this against the ability of open source. That's something maybe the closed source people don't necessarily have to deal with. So now you have to weigh this against the ability to find and correct errors more quickly. And that brings us to community. So what we're looking at here from the Unix perspective, from the Linux perspective, is not necessarily in the ethicality of the IRB, the maintainer of the Linux kernel, didn't, at least in the quotes I saw, did not refer to the IRB. He did refer to the fact that they're doing this. It costs them hours to review these patches, and they do not appreciate being experimented on. But I don't believe he actually referred to this ethical issue, at least not in the same terms. In open source software, what the University of Minnesota and what those researchers have just done is they've compromised the community. So if I'm going to be taking commits, code contributions from outside the community, I either have to be able to ensure that they're clean, or I have to have confidence that my people contributing are honest brokers, right? They are people that are working with me to better the system. And if I lose that trust, that's where the ban comes in, right? So this is a community action to somebody who broke the norms of the community. And I think that that's just as salient as the IRB issues and the other issues with experimenting on human subjects, etc. Because what's now happened is, yes, there was a vulnerability in the Unix kernel, Linux kernel. That vulnerability was ameliorated to a certain extent by the belief that they were dealing with true participants in the community who had the best interests of the community at heart. Once you break that trust, now you're in a situation where the community has to take action to, restore trust both in their code, right? They've now reverted a whole bunch of patches, most of which are probably perfectly innocuous, and may come back in after review. But now they've also lost the trust and the ability of these researchers to actually contribute valid code because they behaved, let's say, nefariously, right? They behaved without informing the community of what they were doing. So anyway, I would love to have more of a talk about this. If there are any comments, I'd love, I'm happy to vet them or pass them on or whatever. But that was just, one of the things about this course. One of the fun things about this course is just the fact that we have this opportunity. Is that we have this opportunity to kind of talk about things that happen in the open source world and kind of discuss them and our thoughts. And what you guys end up getting is a monologue from me about my thoughts. So, any comments? Otherwise, we'll get started with the presentations. I'm happy to take a few more minutes to kind of discuss this. We're in pretty good shape with time as long as you guys stay on track. Kevin, 5 reviews across all the days. Although more reviews are welcomed, but that's kind of where I'm setting the lower bar. If everybody does 5 reviews, that means that on average everybody will get 5 reviews, and that's a pretty good sampling for people. 6 reviews because I'll review everybody, and more if our esteemed mentors and TA are here. All right. Anyway, my diatribe. The real cost of this was it decreased confidence in the Linux kernel externally, and it hurt the University of Minnesota by making them no longer trusted participants, which is hard to get back.